Hello Tech World, this is TechThoughts, and welcome to this special TechThoughts video series focused on learning PowerShell. This is an operationally designed series that aims to get you ramped up and using PowerShell quickly. This is episode 12 in the series, Managing Cloud with PowerShell. As always, if you prefer written documentation, the corresponding article for this topic can be found on the TechThoughts.info blog, which I've linked in the description below. Let's go ahead and get started. Using PowerShell, you can create, manage, delete, monitor, and maintain cloud resources across all three of the major cloud providers, be it Azure, AWS, or Google Cloud. Even if you are in a more traditional on-prem technology stack today, your company will likely be looking to take advantage of cloud capabilities in the near future. Most likely, your company won't be going all in on cloud. A new project or a low-barrier initiative is likely a first step. So you're very likely going to find yourself in a hybrid scenario where some of your resources, or even most of your resources, are on-prem, and some of your resources are in the cloud. That's not a problem. PowerShell can help you manage those traditional on-premise resources, as well as more modern cloud technology solutions. You may also find yourself in a situation where some of the resources are in one cloud provider like AWS, and other resources or components may be in a different cloud provider like Azure. PowerShell can help in this scenario too and handles multi-cloud just fine. Let's dive in to see how we can use PowerShell to manage cloud. To follow along or practice later, you're going to need a cloud account. To do that, you're going to have to visit the AWS site or the Azure site, and you're going to need a valid email address and a credit card to get started. Even though you have to provide a credit card, all of the major cloud providers have some type of free tier. You can see here on the left, the AWS free tier is available. Some of those resources are always free, whereas some are limited to 12 months of free. Azure on the right has something similar, where some of the resources are always free, whereas some are free for an availability period of about 12 months. Don't let costs be your excuse for not diving into cloud learning. Part of your job as a technologist in the modern landscape is to have a basic understanding of cloud costs and billing. You should feel comfortable navigating these free tiers and learning cloud basics without racking up any type of bill. Even if you do make a mistake and forget that you're limited to a certain level of, say, virtual machines for Linux, and end up racking up a $15 bill, that's money you spent investing in yourself. So we are going to be covering quite a bit of code today, and it's likely code you're going to want to refer back to later. Remember that the Learn PowerShell series does have an associated GitHub page that contains all of the code that we're going to be demoing. I've put that link in the description below. You can visit it, come to the Learn PowerShell folder, find episode 12, Managing Cloud with PowerShell, and you can reference all of the code that we're about to demo today. The major cloud providers enable PowerShell capability through the use of creating modules. AWS has the AWS.Tools module, and Azure has the AZ module. You can interact with these with standard PowerShell commandlets like find module and install module. On the left for AWS, I'm going to run install-module AWS.Tools installer. On the right, I'm going to run install-module name AZ. I'm going to go ahead and click enter on both of those and get those modules loaded into our PowerShell session. You can go ahead and say yes to trusting the PowerShell gallery. I went ahead and restarted my two PowerShell sessions just to make sure that they had access to those new modules. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is a difference on the install between AWS and Azure. So on the left side, I'll go ahead and run git module, AWS* list available, so we can see what AWS modules are available. And on the right side, I will go ahead and run git module AZ* list available. Notice that the Azure module went ahead and installed not only the AZ module, but every single sub-AZ module that we're going to need to run every single commandlet for every single service in Azure. So if you want to do something with Azure resources, there's the AZ resources module. If you need to do something with SQL, there's the AZ SQL module. If you need to do something with the network, there's the AZ network module, so on and so forth. But the AWS module just installed the AWS.Tools installer. And if we do a quick git command -module against that, you'll notice that the only commands that it gave us was literally the capability to install other modules. The first one that you're going to want for AWS is going to be AWS Tools Common. So what we're going to do real quick is run an install-module, AWS.Tools module, AWS.Tools.common. It'll ask us to go ahead and confirm. I'll say yes. And now if we do a git module AWS list available, you'll see that we have AWS Tools Common and AWS Tools Installer. The AWS Tools Common module contains most of the commands needed for authentication, as well as generic AWS commands that don't have something specific to do with a specific AWS service. So I'll do a git command -module AWS.Tools.common. And we see here we get some basic stuff like working with AWS credentials, regions, so on and so forth. There are many ways to authenticate your PowerShell session to your cloud account. We'll be demoing one way today on each of these, but make sure to check out the TechThoughts.info blog for other ways to authenticate your PowerShell session. To get started with our AWS, we'll need to log into our AWS account and create a user. So I've logged into my AWS console here, and I'm going to click on IAM. If you don't see IAM under your recently visited services, this is Identity Access and Management. You can simply type in IAM under the list of services and open up IAM. We're going to be creating a user inside of this and using that user's credentials to log in and authenticate our PowerShell session. So I'm going to click Add User, and I'm going to type in TechThoughts. Here you can make a decision about if you want this user to be able to access your AWS account via the AWS web console or just programmatic access. Since we're going to be using PowerShell only, I'm going to give this user just programmatic access. And I'm going to click Next. Here is where you could restrict the user to have certain permissions in your AWS account. For the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to make it a standard administrator, which is going to allow it to create and manage resources throughout the account. You can add tags if you wish. I'm going to go ahead and click Next and Review, and I'm going to create the user. When you create your user, you'll be given an access ID key. I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And inside of my PowerShell window, I'm going to go ahead and type in a variable to hold that. I'll put in A key for access key. And if we pop back to our AWS console, you'll notice that there's also a secret access key, which I'll go ahead and show. I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And again, pop back into my PowerShell terminal and do an S key variable for secret key and paste that in as well. Now that I've gone ahead and punched in those two variables, what I can do now is run the Set-AWSCredential, and I can specify the access key with the variable I previously loaded, as well as the secret key with the secret key variable that I've done as well. And at this point, this PowerShell window on the left is authenticated to my AWS account, and I can start running commands against this particular AWS account. Because I'm an administrator, that means I can provision resources, delete resources, so on and so forth. AWS does operate under the concept of regions, and so there are many regions that AWS supports. The commandlets that you run inside AWS are going to run under the context of that region. So if you want to create a VM, for example, on the East Coast of the United States, you could potentially build, for example, in US East 1. Whereas if you want to build in the US on the West Coast, you might opt into building in US West 2. So we'll need to specify the region that we want to build in, and we can get a list of these available by running git AWS region. And we see here that there are many to choose from. What you'll likely want to do is set a default region for your console. And so we can do that with set default AWS region. With the use of set default AWS region and specifying US West 2, when I click enter, because I used Set-AWSCredential with the TechThoughts user and have now set the default AWS region to US West 2, further commandlets that I run will run under the context of the TechThoughts user building, deleting, or managing in the US West 2 region. Let's switch gears and start authenticating our PowerShell session on the right to Azure. I'm going to go ahead and import the module AZ.Accounts, which is the Azure submodule that contains the authentication commandlets that we need to authenticate to Azure. If you want to see what commandlets are available inside of that submodule, you can always run git-command module and AZ-accounts, and you'll notice that one of those is Connect-AzAccount, which is the next commandlet that we're going to run. I'll go ahead and Connect-AzAccount. Authentication for Azure is very different than AWS. And when you created your Azure account, that would have been tied to an email address and maybe your Microsoft account. So rather than engaging an access key like AWS does, the Azure Connect account is going to prompt us to open up a link inside of our web browser. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this link, and it's going to ask us to punch in this code here. So I'm going to open up a new browser window. Go ahead and go to device login, and I'm going to punch in this access code. That's going to prompt us to sign in with the email account that we associated with our Azure login. And once we type in our password, on the right, you'll notice it went ahead and signed us in, and we can see the account user that we're logged in as, the subscription name that we're logged into, and the tenant ID. For the AWS side, that TechThoughts user that we created is solely dedicated to that account. However, on the Azure side, that email address that you logged in with has the potential to be associated with multiple Azure accounts. You can see all of the accounts that you have authority over using the git-az subscription commandlet. And if you had multiple different subscriptions, you could use the select-az subscription to select a particular subscription that you wanted to start running commandlets against. If you are ever concerned about the active subscription that you are running your commandlets against, you can always run git-az context. And this is the Azure context for the account, subscription, and environment that you'll be running commands against. Let's quickly recap authentication to these two cloud providers. We installed the AWS.Tools common module over on the left, and we installed the AZ module set over on the right. Using the Set-AWSCredential over on the AWS side, we specified our access key and secret key for that user and the default region that we're going to be operating inside. On the Azure side, we went ahead and ran Connect-AzAccount, and we authenticated using our browser by punching in the authentication code and logging in with our email. I'm going to go ahead and clear these two screens. And you may be asking yourself, well, now what? I really want to drive home here that literally the sky is the limit. Do you want to create a virtual server in AWS? You can do that using PowerShell. Do you want to create a fleet of 500 servers over in Azure, pre-configured to your specification? PowerShell can do that in Azure. Do you want to retrieve billing information from your AWS account? You can do that. Do you want to create monitors or alarms inside Azure, or create serverless solutions in both clouds? PowerShell can do all of that too. So let's kind of explore a little bit about some of the commandlets at our disposal and see what we can do with PowerShell in these two major cloud providers. So on the AWS side, I'm going to make sure to import my AWS.Tools common module, and I'm going to run the commandlet get AWS service. I'm going to pipe that to select object and select a couple of pieces of information, the service, service name, and module name. I'm going to format that to a table into auto size so we get a nice pretty output. And actually that didn't show us the module name, so I'm going to blow this up because I don't have enough space, and I'm going to go ahead and rerun that command by pushing the up key on my keyboard. And now what we can see is if you look at and want to run resources in AWS Elastic Beanstalk, that service has a submodule, AWS.Tools Elastic Beanstalk. So you could install this module and start running commands to manage that resource. If you want to do traditional VMs, you can install the AWS.Tools EC2 module, and there are a wealth of commandlets inside of that. If you want to work with Dynamo, there are commandlets for that. If you've been tasked by management to do stuff with budgets or billing, there is a sub-commandlet for that. So we simply got that information by running get AWS service and a few pieces of information to see what modules are out there to help us engage AWS resources. On the right, I can do a git dash command and just find any noun that starts with AZ. One of the nice things about the AZ modules is that they all start with AZ. So if you just look up any command that starts with AZ, it basically gives you every commandlet. Remember that the AZ installed all of the Azure commandlets in one go, whereas on the left, the AWS.Tools module is more modularized and only installed a very small subset of commandlets. So we have all of the AZ commandlets over here on the right already. So I'm going to go ahead and run that command. And as you can see, no exaggeration, there are literally hundreds of commandlets to perform a wide variety of actions inside of Azure, from creating storage accounts, provisioning VMs, creating serverless functions, so on and so forth. It is going to take some Googling and drilling down into these different submodules to find out what capabilities exist. One way to do that is to run git command with some additional options. So here I can run git dash command, and I just want the git verbs. I only want to provide read-only actions, and I only want to do stuff inside the AZ compute submodule. So I'm looking for read-only actions to find out information about Azure Compute. So this could be a way that you drill down to find out, I need to know how many VMs are inside my Azure account, for example. So what commands are at my disposal to do that? And so using this, again, git dash command, looking only for git verbs for anything in the AZ compute submodule, we can start seeing some things like git AZ VM and other useful commandlets for getting different virtual machine information. Again, you can leverage git dash help to find how to utilize these commandlets. So this is just basic PowerShell 101. We see some descriptions about what the commandlet is going to do. It's going to get us some instance level status of the virtual machine. We can, of course, always type in the examples parameter and get some actual real world examples about how to run that particular commandlet. So here we can see we can run git AZ VM location West US, which is going to return Azure VMs that are located in the West US. Speaking of West US and Azure, Azure deals more with geographies, but those geographies are broken up into different regions. Just like AWS had a commandlet for git AWS region, there is a git AZ location, which provides a similar subset of information about the different locations you could deploy Azure resources. So I hope you're starting to see that there's actually quite a bit of similarity from a PowerShell perspective on how you're going to engage and manage these two clouds, even though they're vastly different cloud providers. One thing to note is that on the Azure side, you don't set a default region location like we did on the AWS side. Because in Azure, you create resource groups, and that resource group will be located in a particular region, for example, West US. And then any resources you build within that resource group will automatically be in West US. So you don't have to set a default regional location for the Azure side. Let me clear the screen real quick. And one way you could do that or engage that is just to use the Set-AZ-default command and specify the resource group name. So a resource group inside of Azure, again, is going to be located in a particular region. So whereas we set the default AWS region over on the AWS side, you could set your Azure default to a resource group which is located in a particular region. Okay, so here is our final example. We're going to create a storage resource in both clouds. And so on the left for AWS, that's going to be an S3 bucket. And on Azure side, it's going to be a Blob resource. We're then going to use PowerShell to upload a file from our local device to that new resource in both clouds. We're going to make sure to lock down this new resource so that it's highly secure and does not have public internet access. But then we're going to create a pre-signed URL to enable people to securely download that file worldwide for a set period of time. So this is just a handy way to share files with someone securely for a narrow window. This is something you would probably find a little bit challenging to do inside of the console window, but with PowerShell, we can make short work of it in both clouds. So again, because AWS does not install every single service module, we need to figure out which of these particular modules is necessary to engage S3 for our storage. And so I'm looking through the different services command. And again, this is that same command I demoed before, getting the AWS services and seeing what's available. And so we're looking for S3. which I know is simple storage in AWS. This is sorted alphabetically, and I see here that Amazon Simple Storage Service is in the AWS.Tools S3 module. So I can use the install AWS.Tools module and install the AWS.Tools.S3. I'll go ahead and say yes. And now I can do a git command against that new module. So I can do git command -module AWS.Tools.S3. And now we see here I have a wealth of S3 commandlets at my disposal to do a wide variety of things. I'm keenly interested in this new S3 bucket because I need to create a new bucket to hold my files inside of my AWS cloud account. Again, using basic PowerShell syntax, we're going to do a git help against new S3 bucket. Make sure that it does what we think it does. It creates a new bucket inside Amazon S3. And we can even do examples again and see all we have to do is provide a bucket name. If you don't like using git-help, then fire up a browser window and type in new S3 bucket. You can quickly find the commandlet documentation, see what parameters are required for this command, and even see examples down at the bottom of the page. So you can very rapidly see what is needed to provision resources using PowerShell in the cloud. So I'm going to go ahead and run new S3 bucket. And I'm going to give it the bucket name TechThoughts. And with one simple PowerShell command, I now have a bucket inside of my AWS account named TechThoughts. Now, is that bucket secure? Well, I can run a different commandlet called git s3 public access block. And notice that when I run git s3 public access block and specify that bucket name, that I get an error back that says public access block configuration was not found, which means that this bucket is open to the world. And I don't want that to happen. I want to make sure that this bucket is locked down and available to no one except for myself. And of course, we can use a little bit of PowerShell to go ahead and quickly make that happen. We can provide a couple of parameters inside of a splat for the block public ACLs, ignore public ACLs, and block public policies. And we can add those to the S3 public access block and then recheck using git s3 public access block to see if that commandlet successfully turned our bucket into a private bucket. And we can now see using git s3 public access block that everything for our block set is set to true. Now, at this point in the demo, you may be thinking to yourself, how do you know all of these commandlets? And how am I going to discover all of these commandlets? Well, part of this is practicing in cloud and learning about cloud. You need to know the concept that S3 is a storage container inside AWS. And you need to understand that S3 has the ability to flip on public access or flip off or block public access. And so it's important that you're engaging in learning the capabilities of the different cloud providers. Once you are aware that there is the capability of blocking access to an S3 bucket, it becomes very simple to do things like git command module AWS.Tools.S3 and seeing if there's anything in there using an asterisk for block. So now I see I have an add S3 public access block. I have a git S3 access block. And again, using git help or Googling those commandlets and seeing what requirements are necessary so that you get this information to quickly see, this is what I have to provide PowerShell in order to block access to that S3 bucket. And now, using just a couple of lines and using basic git help and git command, we have created a S3 bucket inside of our AWS account and blocked it from worldwide access. Let's do the same thing over inside Azure. Now remember, all of these commands that I was running over here on the left were being run under the default region of US West 2, which I set using the set default AWS region commandlet at the beginning of this demo. Again, Azure does not have that concept. it builds resources inside of resource groups. And so we will have to create a resource group to hold our blob storage. So I'm going to start off with a couple of variables, a resource group name called TechThoughts, and the location of that is going to be loaded into a variable called location. Again, I know I'm hammering this home quite a bit, but I want you to really take away that if you're flying blind and don't know some of this information, you know that you need to use your native PowerShell commandlets to kind of educate yourself. We know that we need to create a resource group inside Azure. And so I can do a git command and I can do AZ star resource star. We'll actually try star AZ star resource star. Okay, so this is getting all the commands that have AZ and resource in the name. So these are all the commandlets that have something to do with Azure resources. You can take that a step further and type in new at the beginning. And now we have just the commands that contain new, AZ, and resource. And notice, of course, we have a new AZ resource commandlet. We also have a new AZ resource group command. Which of these is the correct one? You can use git help to determine which is the right one. I'm going to go ahead and clear that out real quick. And remember, we have a resource group name, named TechThoughts, and a location of West US. I'm going to go ahead and create a splat. And that splat is going to be new resource group splat, and it's going to contain name and location. And I'm going to create a new AZ resource group. So notice that we now have a new resource group. It's called TechThoughts, and it's located in West US. That provisioned already and is in state succeeded. And now we can build resources inside of that particular resource group, which is located again in West US. With AWS, we could just create a simple bucket, but for Azure Blob, you have to create a storage account to hold that blob. So we will have to create a little bit of a splat here to create that new Azure storage account, which is going to hold our blob. And that storage account is going to specify a few things like, do we want the files to be geolocated around the world or just inside one data center, and what kind of storage we want. Again, while PowerShell can definitely empower you to run these commands, you're still going to have some basic cloud understanding and know that Azure has different kinds of storage and why you would choose one over the other. If you're not familiar with splatting, remember that a splat is just containing a set of parameters. So instead of specifying the parameter here and putting out a long string of all the parameters that are necessary, I can formulate those parameters inside of a hash table and just splat them, all the parameters here, in one go instead of one at a time. So splatting is just kind of a cleaner way to provide all your parameters in one go. So here, again, new AZ storage account. We're providing it the resource group name. So we're building inside that resource group that we just provisioned a moment ago. We're giving the account name TechThoughts storage and specifying some details about what our storage account is going to look like. I'll go ahead and click enter, and that'll take just a moment to provision. Okay, and we have success. We have created a storage account using PowerShell. It's inside of the resource group TechThoughts, again, located in West US, with the storage account name that we provided, which was TechThoughts storage. And so inside of that storage, we have to create now an Azure storage container. And I'm going to paste in a couple of lines of PowerShell that are going to provision that storage container. And this storage container is our blob. And it's ready to start holding files that we can upload to it. And so now we have a bucket in AWS and a blob inside Azure that can hold our file. All right, let's create a quick file to upload using Notepad. I'll type in here, PowerShell can manage the cloud. And I'm going to go ahead and save this into the C drive temp folder. I'm going to call it TechThoughts_text file. Go ahead and close that out. And so now we can use PowerShell to upload that file to our newly provisioned cloud resources. So I'm declaring the location of the file on the local operating system and loading that into file path. I'm giving it a key name, which is the name of the file. I'm specifying the bucket that I want to upload it to, which is our bucket name that we previously created. And I'm going to be using the write-s3 object commandlet with a splat of a couple different parameters. So the bucket name, file, and a little bit of header information. Again, if you had never written an object to S3 before, you could use Git help and go look at the documentation for how to write an object to S3, and you would have working examples of how to do this yourself. So armed with this information, I'm going to go ahead and click enter. And that's gone ahead and written that file up to that new S3 bucket. It is now available to no one because we made sure to block that access to that S3 bucket worldwide. Notice that we did not do any blocking on the Azure side because by default, it comes out provisioned with worldwide access blocked. And so let's go ahead and upload now to our Azure Blob. And just like AWS had a commandlet to write to an S3 bucket, we have the Set-AWSCredential Blob content commandlet, which can write to blob storage. Notice that it contains very similar information, the location inside Azure of the resource that it's going to be writing to, as well as the local file information and what to call that file once it gets up to Azure. And we'll go ahead and click enter on that as well. And it's gone ahead and uploaded that file. Now, at this point in time, we have this information on both cloud providers. So we could come into the console, for example. So in Azure, I can click on resource groups. We see my TechThoughts resource group that I created. Notice that there is a storage account inside of that located in West US, which is what we provisioned. Inside of that storage account, we can click on containers. And notice that we have the container that I created, the TechThoughts container. And inside of that is our TechThoughts text file. Likewise, in AWS, we can come to Services, S3. We can see the TechThoughts bucket that was created. And inside the TechThoughts bucket, we can see the TechThoughts.textfile.txt. Now remember, because both of these resources are blocked from worldwide access, no one can access this particular file. So now what we'll accomplish is we want to share this information with someone securely and just for a very narrow window. So on the AWS side, I'll load the URL variable and I will run the get S3 presigned URL. This will give me a presigned URL to my file. And notice that I'm specifying a bucket name and the key, which is the file name. And notice that I'm specifying an expiration of get date and adding 1 day. So this link is going to be valid for 24 hours and is going to provide access to this bucket and this file. So I'm going to go ahead and click enter. And if I pound out URL inside PowerShell, notice that I get this URL here, and I'll go ahead and pipe that to clip. It's kind of a neat shortcut. And I'm going to go ahead and paste that into a notepad. And so this is our AWS pre-signed URL link that's going to give us access to that file. Likewise, inside of Azure, I can do a quick splat. And notice that while there is a little bit of a difference, it's essentially the same stuff. I'm specifying which container in the name of the file. Again, an expiration is being provided of get date with an add day of 1. So 24 hours is how long this URL will be valid. And the permission I'm providing is read only. We're going to load that into a URL variable as well. And notice that I get a URL back and I can pipe that to clip. And so now we have two URLs, one inside S3, one inside Azure Blob. And if I punch these inside of my browser window, I get an immediate secure download from S3. And I can download that file, open it, and see PowerShell can manage the cloud. Likewise, for our Azure link, it's going to be good for 24 hours. I can punch it into my browser window and get prompted to download that as well. And so using PowerShell in just a couple of lines, we were able to provision resources, secure those resources, and engage those resources in a way that provided some really neat cloud capability. The ability to upload and securely provide a link to a file for your customers, your colleagues, your coworkers from around the world to download a large file, a medium-sized file really quickly. Were you hoping to see some PowerShell on Google Cloud Platform in this demonstration? They do have a website that says they have full cloud control from Windows PowerShell. Unfortunately, as you look over on the Google Cloud PowerShell GitHub, we can see a comment from a Google Cloud employee from 2019 that says that the project is currently in maintenance mode, and we do not plan to support adding any new commandlets. As a result, I decided not to demo this particular subset. While there are some fully functional PowerShell commandlets for Google Cloud, Google has obviously made the decision to no longer support PowerShell. Google Cloud also has the lowest market share compared to the other cloud platform providers, and also has the slowest growth rate. Coincidence? You decide. I hope you found this episode on using PowerShell to manage cloud helpful. Remember that this is a two-piece takeaway. Knowing PowerShell is not going to make you a cloud expert. But if you spend a little bit of time in the free tier and learn the basics of the cloud providers, PowerShell can really propel you forward and allow you to generate some significant capabilities for your business and your career. If you found this video helpful, go ahead and click that like button and subscribe for more Tech Thoughts videos.